I'll just briefly introduce the panelists in the order in which they speak. First is Jason Wittenberg, Professor of Political Science here at Berkeley. Then Danielle Lussier, who's a professor at Grinnell College and one of our renowned PhDs of recent years. And then finally, Professor David Carr, who's the director of the Miller Institute and a professor of law at Berkeley Law. Just to say a couple of words by way of introduction of kind of how this panel is framed, or at least framed in my mind, which can now be completely overturned. But Ernest Gellner, who is one of the leading scholars of nationalism many years ago, wrote that a multi-ethnic nation state is an oxymoron, by which he, I think, meant that the kinds of cleavages that often emerge in countries that are made up of people whose values differ, whose languages may differ, whose kind of normative assumptions about what is right or wrong differ, cannot succeed as a nation state with a common identity and a common purpose and a kind of a efficient economy. In the words of another political scientist, Benedict Anderson, you can't have an imagined community constructed of a pluralistic society. And of course, where that's kind of a aphorism is in a way a hypothesis. And I think that in many contemporary democracies or nations, that hypothesis is really being tested, not just in the transitional democracies, which we've been talking about today, but in Western democracies. European democracies are being transformed by immigration. Canada and the United States have long-term immigrant influx, but even within those countries, the nature of the change in the demography and religious composition of the society pose challenges to the peaceful resolution of conflicts in a way in which the public has a say. Now, again, in political science, there have been many kind of theoretical ways of coping with this. We have the idea of consociational democracy from Arendt Leipart, and many institutional mechanisms that are, federalism being one, designed to cope with this social reality. Authoritarian regimes seem to have a way of clamping down on these passions, at least temporarily, but then the democratic transition, maybe Yugoslavia is a good example of this, unleashes some of these passions with disastrous consequences. So that is kind of the framework that I pose to our panelists, and whether they pay attention to it or not is up to them. But regardless of that, I know they have interesting things to say, starting with Jason.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks for coming. I want to use the brief time I have to basically express some skepticism about the likelihood that democracy can sort of writ large be successful at managing conflict in divided societies. So I'm just going to make a number of points, and they're going to be made, I have a brief amount of time, maybe more provocatively than they would be had I had a longer time to speak. So my first point is that insofar as the preservation of individual or minority group rights is concerned, democratization, or the sort of creation of a nascent democracy, has failed in this task at least as often as it has succeeded. So for every post-dictatorial Spain, or perhaps even more spectacularly India, post-colonial India, both spectacular examples of successful management of pluralism despite, especially in the case of India, unbelievably deep social divisions. There are even more examples, I would argue, of countries where after an initial stab at democracy, things kind of slide backward, either towards outright dictatorship, or if not outright dictatorship, a sort of illiberal slide where the regime, however you want to call it, whatever hybrid term you want to use for it, fails to guarantee the freedoms that were, in many cases, initially promised at the advent of democracy. Just in my area of specialization, this group of backsliders, or however you want to term them, would include Russia, Belarus, almost all of post-Soviet Central Asia, much of the post-Soviet Caucasus. At best, one might label these countries illiberal democracies. At worst, they're outright dictatorships. So that's the first point. Now, you might think that the problem here is that when it comes to democracy, and other people are going to make this point in more detail than me, when it comes to democracy and its promotion, there's been a tendency to reduce the concept to organizing and holding free and fair multi-party elections. And to some extent, this is true. In other words, the problem with the first point is that if you only organize free and fair multi-party elections and do nothing else, things may indeed backslide. We all know that such elections are a necessary feature of democracy because it's really the best way that we know of kind of gauging the popular will. We want to know what people think. But as the American founding fathers appreciated, and we in some cases occasionally seem to forget, the results of free and fair elections don't necessarily yield parliaments or presidents committed to defending minority views and what we recognize as civil rights. So earlier today, I mean, you all read the papers, including me. Earlier today, I read an article online about a statement on the Muslim Brotherhood website in Egypt. The statement condemns violence against U.S. interests, but avers that free speech should not extend to acts of barbaric aggression that humiliate all Muslims. Now, there are people who know much more about Egypt than I do. I'm not going to say more about this. But I will make this point, that however much the results of the Egyptian election reflect popular opinion, I personally am pessimistic about the prospects, given the current president and the prevailing parliament. I'm pessimistic about the prospects of what we would recognize as a liberal democracy, evolving in that country. So whatever's going to develop, it's going to be an Egyptian version, which is of course fine, but this notion of managing pluralism, which is the theme, so pluralism is going to mean something different in that context than it means in our context. So you might think, so the pure democracy, just elections and parties doesn't seem to work well. You might think that in addition to multi-party elections, it's important to have certain other institutions that go along with it, right? Rules that protect minorities and individual rights from the whim of majority opinion. This was, of course, the view of people like James Madison, who advocated the U.S. system of checks and balances for precisely this reason, to guard against the whims of the whim of the majority. Constitutions and other rules of the democratic game that channel the inevitable social conflicts toward peaceful resolution can obviously be a great thing. They work in many circumstances. But I want to add one caveat to this. They have to be respected by people within the system. The first Soviet constitution was among the most democratic in the world, but its humane provisions, wonderful on paper, were observed mostly in the breach. So the Constitution itself doesn't help you that much. Rules do not enforce themselves. There have to be enough powerful people or groups who are willing to abide by and defend those rules. So leaders have to refrain from jailing or harassing their political opponents and be willing to step down if they lose an election. The military has to refrain from intervening in domestic politics. The majority has to recognize some limit on its ability to implement its preferred view of society. Otherwise, the Constitution, no matter how well designed, is basically a scrap of paper. So my fourth point then is, you might think, okay, let's look at the countries that have best mastered the art of managing pluralism within the democratic rules of the game and see what they did right. So places like the US and Canada, Japan, West Europe, and among the newer democracies in former communist East Europe, places such as the Czech Republic and Poland. When I consider such countries, I can identify a few reasons why they might be successful at managing pluralism. But when you think about it, none have much to do with how democratic their systems are. In the case of the Czech Republic and Poland, the job was made much easier, first through genocide and ethnic cleansing. Czechoslovakia and Poland had lots of problems managing pluralism before World War II, when both countries had large populations of national minorities, substantial national minorities. But we all know the story. The Jews got killed during the war, and the Germans and the Ukrainians got deported after the war. And both Poland and the Czech lands became much more nationally homogeneous. Now that's not to say, national homogeneity is not to say that these countries don't have multiple conflictual viewpoints that need to be resolved through democratic means. Of course, all countries do, including them. But, if you will, history got rid of the deepest social divides before they democratized. Moreover, during the post-communist period, most countries in Eastern Europe have had every reason to avoid domestic human rights abuses due to the conditionality imposed by the European Union for membership. And I would say tellingly, since Eastern Europe got membership in the European Union, there has actually been some civil rights backsliding. I'm happy to say more about that in the Q&A. Finally, almost finally, am I doing okay on time?
You got lots of time.
Okay. When I consider the established democracies of West Europe and North America, I see various strategies for protecting minority viewpoints. In the US, there's the Bill of Rights and our Byzantine electoral system. There's Canadian confederalism. Jack mentioned consociationalism, so there's a tradition of consociationalism in the Low Countries. There's corporatism in lots of, or historically has been corporatism in lots of countries. There's the Swiss canton model, and on and on and on. And I think it's hard to gainsay the success of these various institutional forms. But, and this is an important but, we should also acknowledge that the reasons for their success have less to do with their democratic character than with their undemocratic consequences. So consider the US. My guess, just for example, is that a majority of Americans would support a total ban on pornography. But 9 unelected justices have decided that it's protected speech, and it takes far more than a simple majority of the American vote to change the Constitution. In fact, it's not even just a supermajority, it's a super-duper majority amplified by the complexities of a federal system. The US Electoral College, which some people have called for abolishing, has more than once awarded the US presidency to candidates who lost the popular vote. That's not a democratic feature. That's something else. Our winner-take-all system in the US has meant that minority views do not get separate representation in the US Congress. So the US Congress isn't particularly representative of the diversity of viewpoints in the US, and this is a result of the rules of the game. Now, lest you misunderstand what I'm saying, there were and are good reasons to maintain, many if not all of these features of US democracy. But we should recognize that they work because they're anti-majoritarian, or if you, more provocatively, anti-democratic. They restrain the majority from imposing its preferred view of society. Right? They work because they're anti-democratic, not because they better approach some democratic ideal. Right? Just to choose a couple of other examples, Canada, the Canadian Confederation stays together in part because at some level a minority of francophones have been given an equal voice to a very large majority of anglophones. Right? 3/4 or something like that of the population of Canada are Anglophone and not Francophone. Right? The Swiss model is in some ways even more stark, which is to say, the Swiss model of a German-speaking canton and French-speaking canton and so on and so forth. Their solution to getting rid of conflict is to basically separate all the peoples in their respective corners and give them all basically self-government with a veneer at the federal level. So to sum up a brief sum up and then a sentence on its relation to other countries that will be talked about here. Unfettered democracy, I think, has a poor track record of protecting minority rights. elections and just elections with nothing else. And where democracy has worked, it's because the system has included anti-democratic features, or, if you will, anti-majoritarian features. The lesson for some countries in some sort of transition is that we, i.e. people that are interested in democracy or democracy promotion, we should not be shy about supporting rules that protect minorities from the whim of the majority, even when those rules are seen as dictatorial. So you know, our notion of democracy that we should be giving, and it's true of our own system, and perhaps most so in the US, because of the way the founders designed the system. It's among the most anti-majoritarian democracies of the advanced democracies. So even we don't give the majority free rein to impose its will. And if we don't give it, I'm not sure why we should why we should be asking Egyptian liberals or Iraqi liberals or in Afghanistan, all countries that cry out for some sort of, I'm not sure, other people know better than I what model is the best model for those countries, but certainly a sort of a pure model seems likely to lead to results that we're not very happy about. And when I say that we should be supporting sort of, let me call them dictatorial features of the new system, I don't just mean in the way that the US sometimes does informally with a wink and a nod. It's like, okay, officially we're promoting democracy, but unofficially, we're going along with this. But I think as a matter of advocacy, it would be much better, to realize our own values, assuming those countries want to realize values of pluralism, which, by the way, is an assumption that other countries want to realize pluralism in the way that we understand pluralism. That if you want to realize those values, you may have to incorporate these so-called dictatorial features into the system. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you for, I want to thank the organizers for the invitation to be here. I'm very humbled to share my much more limited knowledge with so many experts. And I'm going to pick up on some of the points that Jeremy and Steve introduced at the beginning of when the conference opened. And in particular, I'm picking up on Steve's suggestion that we have to think as scholars, as sort of scholars, what have we learned that we can share? And in particular, I'm thinking about this issue of capacity building, that for democracy, for new democracies to be able to take form, we have to empower individuals, and yet at the same time, as a political scientist, in particular somebody who works on political behavior, I'm a firm believer in institution structuring behavior, and I think that there's something to be said for the way that political institutions can be, I'm maybe a little bit more of an optimist than Jason, the way that political institutions can be structured that can help to manage pluralism. At the very least, we should have a goal of allowing political institutions to manage differences in a way that leads to productive political competition rather than greater division that could threaten the foundations of the state in which the political community is existing, as well as the promise for democracy. And in doing that today, I'm going to actually talk a little bit more empirically about two cases that I know particularly well. Post-Soviet Russia and post-Suharto Indonesia. And in doing so, I also am hoping to sort of foreshadow the conversations for tomorrow, where we'll have the afternoon panel on Russia. But in the morning, where we're going to be talking about the Middle East, I think that Indonesia, as the world's largest Muslim democracy and a country that has undergone a very successful transition, can offer us some interesting insights for managing pluralism. So for those of you who know less about these countries, it's okay if the slide's not perfectly straight. These are just Freedom House scores for Russia and Indonesia from the period 1989 to 2011. So in Russia, we can see that democratization began in the late Soviet period. It plateaued in the early 1990s, began to decline in 1998, and reached a further decline during Putin's second term in 2004. Indonesia began to democratize after Suharto's resignation in 1998 and has successfully continued to do so, becoming one of these outliers in terms of punching above its weight in terms of becoming a democracy that doesn't have a very strong socioeconomic background. Now, both of these countries are very hard cases when we think about managing pluralism. They have ethnic and ethno-national differences. They have enormous differences in diversity in terms of religious confessionalism, regional diversity, and also really important diversity in terms of political ideology at a very fundamental level in terms of who constitutes the political community and what sort of state should they have. And I'm not going to talk so much about the ethnic or ethno-national or religious differences at this point. I'm happy to discuss that in Q&A. But I want to spend a minute talking about regional dispersion here, because it plays a very important role in understanding the choices in political institutions these two countries have made. So for those of you who are less familiar, Russia at the beginning of its post-Soviet period was a federation that was comprised of 89 regions. Several have merged and there are now 83. And there's actually 3 levels of regions in Russia. So the green in this map are national republics. The whitish colored are just basic regions. And then there's also autonomous okrugs, which are the sort of yellowy colored things, and there's one autonomous oblast, the Jewish autonomous oblast. So of these 83 provinces, 26 of them are of an ethno-federal character, meaning that there's something about national identity that comprises how they're formed. In total, about 17% of the Russian population lives in a national republic. So this is not an inconsiderable group. And something that's worth pointing out is that several, though not all of these republics, so the ones that are green, are located on the Russian border, which creates geographic conditions that create opportunities for separatism in ways that are much harder for say, for example, Sakha in the middle of the Far East to accomplish. Indonesia has 33 provinces. Some, but not all of the regional borders drawn in Indonesia create local ethnic majorities. In this case, though, one can think about the archipelagic nature of Indonesia also creating geographic conditions that are favorable to separatism. Many of you are familiar with the conflicts in Aceh and Papua. So the farthest eastern and farthest western, farthest eastern provinces in Indonesia. But another point about regional diversity that I want to emphasize here, in both of these cases, has to do with population density. So in the case of Indonesia, this island here, the island of Java, actually holds 60% of the population in Indonesia. The remaining 40% are much more sparsely populated throughout the remaining regions. As far as Russia is concerned, we have a case where Russia is about 73% urban. So you have large population centers in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and several other cities, whereas the population in this part of the country is much more sparse. And that can create very different ideas about political ideology, about identity, etc., that are based not necessarily on ethnic or confessional divisions, but on the way that populations are situated, whether it's urban or rural. I just want to talk for a moment about these ideological differences. So in the case of Russia at the end of the Soviet era, there was this big question that still remains to be answered, which is, what is the national idea? Was Russia going to develop a civic sense of identity, which was something that was promoted, at least very briefly, by Yeltsin? The idea of, there's 2 words in the Russian language that translate into Russian and English. One is Rossiyskiy, which is a civic, it comes from the word for Russian that's used in the Federation. It's a civic identity. It's not ethno-national, versus Ruski, which is ethno-national. So was Russia going to develop this civic identity, or was it going to develop an ethnic identity that was based more on some sort of Slavic core, with Orthodoxy as a core component of it, or was it going to develop something else that was maybe perhaps in the middle? And this is still an issue that remains unresolved. In Indonesia, this difference about what the foundation of the state comes from a different division, and that's one between an Islamic identity versus what's called in Indonesia the Pancasila identity. And Pancasila is the Indonesian national ideology. It's based on 5 principles. It goes back to the independence movement, in which they all sort of united around various ethnic divisions to try to create a sense of civic nationalism. And the question about whether or not Indonesia should develop an Islamic foundation of the state actually really does go back to the struggle for independence in the 1940s, where there was an enormous discussion about proposed language to the Indonesian constitution that was ultimately not included. But this language said that adherence to the Indonesian state with the obligation of its Muslim adherents to follow Sharia. And that was left out in 1945. And it's not really at present a very highly political issue in Indonesia. And one of the reasons for this is that in the post-Suharto era, mainstream Muslim organizations and political movements have actually spoken out against it. As a result, the lack of support from these organizations have inhibited mass support for changing the foundation of the Indonesian state. Another area where we might see some ideological differences or managing areas where pluralism needs to be managed has to do also with ideas about the winners and losers of economic transitions and how the state should be involved in redistribution of wealth, for example. And now I want to spend the rest of my remarks here talking about the institutional mechanisms that we've seen in these two countries. In particular, I'm going to talk about federalism, decentralization, and party and electoral rules. As Jack said when he was introducing this panel, authoritarian regimes have an excellent mechanism for managing pluralism, which is just repression. They can prevent certain identities from ever becoming salient and being mobilized around. And this is something that any country undergoing a transition needs to deal with. Now in Russia, with this map showing, Russia developed a federal system. In many respects, it was sort of an inherited artifact of the Soviet system. But it was an asymmetric federal system in the 1993 Constitution. So the different colors here created this very ambiguous situation where all of the subjects of the federation are technically equal under the Constitution, yet these ethnic republics have some sort of privileged status. And what happened is that in the 1990s, because of this ambiguous relationship, Yeltsin negotiated a very large number of bilateral treaties with each of the regions that were generally meant. It started off with the ethnic regions. The first bilateral agreement was in Tatarstan, right there, which was sort of trying to threatening for its own greater autonomy in the way that Chechnya had done down here. These bilateral agreements gave a lot more control over to specific regions and simultaneously bled the central treasury of any meaningful resources. The other thing that they led to was an enormous amount of contradiction between federal and local laws. This, by the mid-1990s, you had a third of the regions, so again, out of more than 30 regions, had negotiated bilateral treaties. And the chaos of this situation is largely what contributed to the re-centralization of the state under Putin in his first term. And also is what contributed to the dilution of regional powers, which also consequently led to a dilution of democracy. Now, in Indonesia, you have a very different situation on your hands. Indonesia actually, technically speaking, is not a federation. It's a unitary state. Indonesians have been very adamant about pursuing a unitary state out of concern that federalism would contribute to greater separatist tendencies. But though Indonesia doesn't have a textbook federation in terms of, again, the political scientific definition that would give shared autonomy under a constitution, it's engaged in one of the largest decentralization programs that we've seen in the modern era. Between 1999 and 2004, almost 2 million civil servants and more than 60% of the national development budget were transferred from central to local authorities. And by local authorities, I mean levels below the provinces. The level of government is what city and regency level. Regency is a combination of smaller villages. They're the ones that have been empowered by this. So if we think about the success and failure of federalism and decentralization, as far as Russia is concerned, asymmetric federalism, on the one hand, you could say it held the country together during a period of absolute chaos in the 1990s when we weren't sure if this country was going to exist in its present form. Yet at the same time, it also contributed to divisions that hindered the development of any shared national interest or identity across the population. And one could argue that it also fueled some of the ethnocentrism that we continue to see emerging in Russian politics to this day. As far as Indonesia is concerned, this decentralization program has been largely a resounding success in terms of diffusing potential sources of conflict and separatism while also providing a meaningful levers of autonomy where it needs to happen that have also contributed to the legitimacy of the democratizing regime. However, a really interesting byproduct of this, and this actually picks up on Jason's points that he made, is that by decentralizing and giving more autonomy over to local governments, one of the things that we've seen is the adoption of Sharia bylaws in lots of areas of Indonesia at the local level. And these bylaws might arguably be in conflict with national legislation, although They haven't really been working their way through the court system. One of the interesting things that political scientists have discovered is that, contrary to what people might expect, these bylaws are not coming out because Islamic parties or Islamist parties are promoting them. They generally tend to be adopted when secular parties promote them when they're trying to compete against Islamic or Islamist parties on the local levels. And so what they're doing is they're competing on how Islamic they can be. So in my final comments, I just want to talk a little bit about electoral and party rules. So in both countries, in both Russia and Indonesia, it's prohibited for parties to organize on ethno-national lines. And in Russia, it's also prohibited for them to organize on religious lines. In Russia, party registration laws that were introduced in the early part of the 2000s reinforced the development of what we call very broad catch-all parties. The revisions that were introduced during Putin's second term raised the requirements for registering political parties, demanding that a party have 50,000 members and branches with at least 500 members and at least half of the regions in the country. So this basically prevents the development of regional parties. After 2004, Russia also moved to a strictly proportional representation system, which further reinforces parties. Many aspects of these rules, and this is where I agree with Jason, were very anti-democratic. But they did reduce the potential salience of ethno-national, religious, and regional differences. Maybe this is a good thing. We could also argue, though, that those conflicts ended up being moved into other domains and out of the electoral domain. As far as Indonesia is concerned, their legislatures also elected via proportional representation, and they've done something very interesting. To be eligible to contest a national legislative election, a party must hold at least 2% of the seats in the existing legislature. If you don't meet that criterion, parties have to convince the Central Electoral Commission that it has offices in at least 2/3 of the provinces and 2/3 of the districts within the provinces. Again, this reinforces broad catch-all parties. In order to nominate a presidential candidate, a party or a coalition of parties has to have won 20% of the vote in the most recent legislative election. What this serves to do is it tends to promote moderation among political views. Although, the negative side, it can also create very meaningful difficulties in establishing workable governing coalitions. Now, since I'm almost out of time, what I want to do is just give you a little bit of information on how Islamic parties have done in Indonesia under these electoral and party rules. So of the 9 parties currently sitting in the Indonesian legislature, 4 are Islamic parties, and collectively they hold about 30% of the seats in the legislature. This is actually 10% fewer seats than they held in the previous legislature. None of these parties were able to field their own presidential candidates in 2009, so all of the presidential and vice presidential pairs in 2009 came from secular parties. And just a final point, and this is, I think, a very important one, since part of this panel is discussing the rule of law, where both Russia and Indonesia have failed institutionally in managing pluralism is upholding the existing laws they have on the books. So both countries fail to protect minority rights. We've seen in recent years increases in violence against religious minorities in Indonesia, increases in hate crimes against ethnic minorities and some religious groups in Russia. You know, Russia's no longer a democracy, so I hate to say it, but that stuff doesn't surprise me so much. But in my personal opinion, the failure to uphold these minority rights is probably the greatest barrier, the greatest threat to Indonesian democracy. And I'll conclude on that pessimistic note.
Thank you, Danielle, for fixing the PowerPoint. Good afternoon, everyone. My thanks to Alan and Jeremy for the invitation and for organizing this. My area is public international law, but for the last several years I've been doing some work in the rule of law for a variety of reasons. And I sponsored a talk in Washington, D.C. This past spring with the UN Secretary General. The topic was rule of law because the General Assembly, that's their main focus this fall, on rule of law. And during lunch, we started to talk about what is rule of law, and the Secretary General's focus was almost exclusively on accountability of officials. And what that leads to is part of my talk is going to be just about what is rule of law for a moment, a few things I've observed about that whole discussion over this past couple years, and then turn to the theme of the panel about managing pluralism within rule of law. So first, as far as what is rule of law, one of the first things you start to see people fill it is the concept people fill with their desires that they seek. And even here in this panel, we are discussing it in terms of managing pluralism. Rather than human rights, people look at it as a way to protect minority rights, individual rights. Business, if you move into, in the context of the World Economic Forum, the business community, their discussion is about level playing field. The whole question of rights is a separate, it's not something part of the discussion. Similarly, in the World Bank, almost to what we're doing, it's about good governance, that somehow that allows an interoperability of discussion of the way you would possibly connect. We need it both for them internally and we need it between countries. So there is this vagueness to the whole concept. I would say within the law world and political science world, there is more than that. There are several definitions. There's one intergovernmental group called the Venice Commission on Democracy. There's a rather now famous book by Lord Bingham. But this is probably the most detailed piece of work, the World Justice Project. And I'm going to come back to this definition in a second, but let's just look at the four elements, because it's actually, you can start to say, the rule of law project. It's a big project, right? Government and officials and agents are accountable under the law. So that's one, that's what the Secretary General was thinking about. The laws are clear, publicized, stable, and fair, and protect fundamental rights. The process by which laws are enacted is accessible, fair, and efficient. Access to justice is provided by competent, independent, and ethical adjudicators, ... Now, one reason I put this up for you is I wanted, and I used a PowerPoint, was to show this document here. And that's from this book. The World Justice Project is in its second phase. It's in its third phase at the moment. This was the result of the second, in which they've now gone through 60 countries. And if you go through, this is mostly Gates money. There are 8 dimensions. There are 4 principles. Those are the 4 principles that were just described. Accountable government, security and fundamental rights, open government and regulatory enforcement, and access to justice. A little hard to see, but there's a circle of the maximum you could get on a spider diagram. And then inside, it's how Kazakhstan scored on these various points. The other colors are countries in that region. Are they doing better or less, and et cetera. They divide that into 9 dimensions. There are only 8 listed here. They've added a 9th called informal justice. They're trying to penetrate down into, given that most countries actually have quite weak access to justice, including the United States, simply by, in terms of cost, there is some other system of justice present that is harder to calibrate. And those 9 break into 52 sub-factors, and they draw on 400 variables to make those spider diagrams. They are very good about sharing data for the political scientists in the room, and they want to do that more. They really want to do that. They do not, to my understanding, somehow cross this over to democracy. In any way. So let me just, I had a few observations from that. One, rule of law is programmatic. It's not attained, right? I could go back and add more of those charts, but nobody gets to the outer ring of those charts. And that's important because there are questions of expectations. We're going to go into a country and we're going to put rule of law in place. That's not the correct way to phrase it. We are going to try and put some elements of a rule of law. We're going to try to promote it. This is a long-term project. You got to be with me over the long run. Second, there is a similarity to democracy. Both democracy and rule of law are programmatic, hard to attain. And yet, they both exist. They both demand on both rely on each other. And I don't have a sense of where that reliance is most important between the two. The second point is rule of law is more than competent institutions. for some end, but rather it also specifies ends. And the important point here is, Ambassador Kingsman said at one point, building democracies is not about exporting our norms. And I think we understood what he meant, that sometimes we unconsciously are sending lots of them out and thinking we know how to do it. But the second point is, in rule of law, we have a lot of norms buried in the whole concept. And if you back up, that's not to say they're objectionable, but they're buried there. If we back up here to the second definition, the laws are clear, publicized, stable. You could hit period right there, right? And fair, and protect fundamental rights, including security of persons and property, right? That's a lot plugged in there about what rule of law is. That's not about the institutions, that's about the content of the law. And I guess to just stay that for a second, I would reframe something that Jason said. Jason, you at one point were saying how minority rights, these rights here, right, these fundamental rights, could be buried there. These are individual, but you can phrase them as minority rights or group rights. That is anti-democratic. I think the way the Rule of Law Committee would look at it is the Constitution itself is an act of democracy, right? And democracy allows you to go in and change those fundamental rights if you wanted to. What is anti-democratic is the way in which the court has been selected to enforce that fundamental right against a majority in a given moment, who has heated passions or whatever. But that's the reconciliation in the Rule of Law Committee about how, in the Rule of Law world, about how that plays out. Third point, going back to observations. States are tiring and suspicious of the Rule of Law project. So I mentioned that the General Assembly this fall has a focus on rule of law. It's viewed as simplistic, not ambitious, boring. They've resisted most efforts to really, the states, not the UN, has resisted efforts to have a more ambitious agenda. And there are at least two things going on. One, they've been at this project for a while. It's costly. It's expensive. It takes attention. Often takes talented people in your country to work at it. So they're just a little, if they were thinking it was going to be quick rather than programmatic, they're a little on the tired end. Second, there is a suspicion for the second reason, that there is an end in it. So it may be, I think one thing important to bear in mind, we sort of had it in the discussion from the Indian Commissioner of Elections. If you build an independent, impartial judiciary that's strong, you have created a force within your country that you do not control. Someone controls it. It could be internal. It could present a challenge to you. It could be external, in the sense that it is now something, if the law is phrased somehow to it, if it comes from the outside, it will apply it. So it becomes an independent force, and not all states are ready for the implications of that, or at least they wonder what the implications of that are. I mean, even if we put aside very self-interested, just protecting elites. Now, one implication of this that I thought about, Jeremy, was you mentioned that in your statistics, democracy is rising. On the other hand, there's something here I'm asserting anecdotally that it seems there's something tired about the Rule of Law project. And I would only say that's not necessarily inconsistent. It's not inconsistent in the sense that what I'm saying here, there's a top-down tiredness to promoting rule of law. It may be, just as with democracy, there is an organic reason that it will continue to increase in some of those many spider diagrams, but for a different reason or without help in that way. Finally, I want to say I really appreciate the rule of law as mentioned here today. So the reason I was pulled into this is this area is I chair a group on rule of law within the World Economic Forum. And if you look at the program, if you work in the World Economic Forum, they never mention law. They never mention rule of law. It's business and government. It's a word they don't really want to deal with. They know it's important. They want this committee, and I'm not being bitter here. It's just that, I mean, what we did was we renamed our work. You know, we have a certain thing we work on, and we call it coordinated governance. They love that title. You know, governments have to work together at problems, right? And you need institutions to do that. Fine, let's talk about that. But rule of law is way beyond lawyers. I mean, lawyers are involved with it, and what I think is important is to recognize it's deeply political, what's going on here. And it's all about design, it's all about basic agreement in one society about what should be the structure. And so it shouldn't be left just to lawyers. So I'm happy it's included today. All right, so let's turn to, this last slide is so boring, I don't even want to put it up. I put this all up for just that one chart. But let me just say, if you're going to, you know, if we go back to the first point, that rule of law is a concept you're filling with your desires. Our desire here is to manage pluralism. And you are asking of rule of law a very hard task. We're not talking about courts to enforce a contract between two individuals. We're not talking about adjudication of a crime. We're talking about what Derry earlier talked about, power. And you're asking courts and the whole system to step in and mediate, protect the basic structure of the deal. And that's a very big thing to ask of courts. So I was interested in the comments from India that the Commission somehow withstands all that pressure. Because I've looked at the independence and impartiality of courts in Latin America, and the executive can reach in and change them, eliminate them. It's very strong in some countries. So the more power you give them, the more they're going to be tested. So just a basic proposition. How are they aiding with political pluralism? They're doing it in two ways. This is all, I think, rather obvious. On the one hand, there is protection of civil and political rights long beforehand. And secondly, they somehow police the election itself. It may be an electoral committee that does it first, and then the courts guard them, as the Indian representative described. But those are big tasks to ask of courts. They are different functions. In the courts literature, courts political science literature, you look at functions of courts. And this is a specific area unto itself, that one is heading into preservation of the system itself. The second is this vaguer task about cultural pluralism, which I think is a very difficult one to describe, and I think a challenge for courts. Partly in the way the program is worded, it's somehow, how does the rule of law create a space for inclusion culturally in a society? And what I would say in part that's not discussed in the literature very much to my knowledge, it leads to what Jack was describing, and that is, what is the origin of this rule of law and where did it come from? And so there's a recent book by Francis Fukuyama where he talks about, has a small section part where he talks about how rule of law fit into the rise of political order. And it fits with something Jason said, but it fits on that actually the legitimacy of law with some big L preceded its institutionalization, that it was somehow rooted in the community and there was something there. And we come to the question that Jack raises, how is that system there when the community itself is rather fragmented? When in reality probably there is a dominant privilege in that whole basis of rule of law toward one of the minorities, one of the groups in the country. And can that group be, therefore, can that institution be viewed as a legitimate mediator of all the cultural discussion that needs to happen. Danielle, in part, so it'd be good for discussion after. One solution is somehow the people are fragmented and we're just dispersing authority into homogeneous groups. The harder Yugoslav problem is when it's villages right next to each other or they're really mixed in the same village. And that federal autonomy solution is not available in the same way. And that's where the courts need to do something. The second point I'd make on this that I wonder about is what you see in some areas in Europe and in some of the global rights discussions, there is this sense of a margin of appreciation. So you have a right, but what the right means in a specific area is formed by that specific area. So there is some margin. You can't go way out, but there's some margin to how it's implemented. And that you could phrase as a difference, both are rights, but you can phrase it as a difference between a principle and a rule. So for example, women have dignity, or that's a principle, versus women cannot be forced to wear a headscarf. That's a rule. Principle is dignity. I'm sorry if I said that wrong. And that leads to some accommodation. It doesn't, all that is saying is solve that in the sphere of politics between yourselves about what is appropriate. Is it minimum dignity? Your culture decided it. But there's some range for difference between people. But it's a hard concept, and courts tend to move toward rules. It's some natural tendency to make it too uniform. I guess I'd close saying that rules are dangerous because rules can smother cultural pluralism quite easily. Thank you.
James Madison had sort of two concepts of how to manage the potential tyranny of the majority. One which you spoke of was kind of in Federalist 51, institutional checks and balances. Federalist number 10 was a different kind of concept, which actually I would call an organic approach to dealing with the possible tyranny of the majority. And actually that was a kind of a super pluralism, that the country should be large enough and the electoral constituency should be large enough that no single faction, he called it, would be sufficiently large to dominate. But then I think he shied away from that and moved to this institutional thing. But I would argue that in some sense there's a dual protection is important, and that goes to what Danielle mentioned, both sort of identity management as well as institutional management. So I just interested in some kind of response to that. The second thing, which was very interesting, listening to David talk about the rule of law, and he concluded sort of, you know, to what extent does the rule of law threaten those in power? So if the rule of law threatens the executive is going to try and stack the judiciary and sort of have a different kind of meaning. And so to me, again, some of the questions sort of, this is old-fashioned, what are the preconditions for democracy? What happens to if you lose an election? What happens to you? How much do you really lose? And you know, if you're going to lose it all, then you're going to resist losing an election, obviously. And the second thing goes to, you know, the old-fashioned notion is democracy, our democracy and capitalism entwined, because to the extent that being the executive gives you the tremendous power over extracting wealth, then you're obviously going to be less willing sort of to give up that control. So that's another kind of social dimension to this entire process. And we talk about some of these regimes. The Egyptian regime, it's changed. One of the things, I know nothing about it, but you read how much Mubarak, how much the army, how much these sort of executive authorities controlled of the economy, and therefore, of course, they aren't going to be happy to give it up. One last observation, forgive me for going on so long, but in thinking about this, and thinking about this really in the Western world, because I'm a student of American politics and to a lesser extent Western European politics. You know, Isaiah Berlin long ago wrote famous essay, Two Concepts of Liberty. Negative liberty was your freedom against the state. Positive liberty was a kind of the capacity to use democratic voice, elections, majority rule, to achieve certain goals, like the expansion of the welfare state, redistribution of income, etc. And it seems to me that you could argue that there's sort of, don't want to steal from the master, but of course, invention, flattery, plagiarism, whatever. Plagiarism, imitation is the best form of flattery. So I think that we can conceive of democracy in similar terms. Negative democracy versus positive democracy. And I would argue that after the 70s in the United States, partly out of disillusionment with government, decline of trust of government, and in Europe as well, there's developed a whole set of institutions that strengthen negative democracy, including mechanisms such as constitutional courts, independent central banks, international organizations that, fundamentally limit popular sovereignty. I never thought, having studied, comparative government in the Stone Age at McGill University, that I would see the end of the Westminster model, where the European Court of Justice would be telling the Brits what to do. To me, that is kind of a, very shocking sort of decline of civilization kind of outcome, but it's there and it's real. And so sort of positive democracy is much more embedded, both domestically and internationally, in these other kinds of phenomena. And so the question really becomes, while you emphasize minority rights and sort of the negative side of things, at a certain point in time, doesn't democracy mean that if you win an election, your side gets to implement some policies that you're interested in? And so one can't sort of lean over too far in these kind of negative constraints that we've mainly been talking about because of the fear of what the majority, might do. So that's my long speech, but Alan told me I should make it, and I obey him. And maybe the panelists can comment briefly on this, and then we have questions from the floor. Go ahead, Jason.
Well, I'm glad you pointed out the other side of Madison. I mean, there are, depending on the sort of the distribution of preferences in society, you might have a society in which no one is able to impose their will, and so there's a de facto pluralism without having to restrain a majority, because that majority is very hard to muster. People have made this argument in the case of India, for example, that although 80% Hindu, that's more of a fiction in terms of the reality of what divides Northerners from Southerners and caste divisions and so on and so forth. So I would agree that there might be these, or a case where there's a majority that's so large that they don't care about minority. I mean, I have a student now who's an Indian Parsi, incredibly small community, and basically they do whatever they want because they're not a threat to anyone, and basically no one cares what they do, and so these are potential models. But I think and this gets to something that David said. I don't think we should be shy about, if you think of that kind of a model, we shouldn't be shy about things like population exchanges and the shifting of internal borders in a way that create the conditions for future peaceful, because that's exactly what happened in in Western Europe. It's just that it happened so long ago that people forget about it. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Anyway.
I don't know that I have a very coherent thought to share, except for I want to pick up on the point you raised about, doesn't democracy mean that you win and you can do something? And I think that that's an easier thing to accomplish where you have less pluralism at stake. And I think that it's hard for me to, with the countries I study, which are not advanced democracies, I fear what it means when the majority means they can do something, without sufficient protections for minorities. Yet I think something that's really relevant here relates to this issue about the positive versus the negative freedoms. So in the case of Russia, those negative freedoms are very valued. The freedom to not have to participate, the freedom to not have to be involved in politics if one doesn't want to. The problem is when people start to absorb those negative freedoms so strongly, it leaves the positive freedoms left in the hands of the group that shouts the loudest, and they may or may not be supporting a majority position. I think I'll stop there.
So briefly, I see lots of hands. You know, on the Madison 10, what I find interesting, it might relate to rule of law as well in the opposite direction. And in my experience, small countries have a difficult time having a rule of law with an independent and impartial judiciary. And I think the extreme is Luxembourg takes their judges from outside the country, right? But where in Latin America, what job do you have if you're out? You only need one case to reverberate throughout the whole judiciary and tame everyone. So it's a very, the smaller it gets, the fewer opportunities, it's hard. The second point would be, I'm not sure about the lack of range of opportunity. You get elected, if their individual rights channel what your initiative is, how you phrase your channel, how you phrase your initiative. I don't think it blocks your initiative. Property rights might block your initiative, and that, but that would be hard to shift. But individual rights, I don't think does that. I think it just channels things. And the EU, UK, that's just a different, that the UK would ever agree to it was a surprise. Shifting populations is a discussion to have, but I think it would be very hard to have in a world of individual rights, because that is blocked, I would say. I think that you're channeled so hard away because in the present world we think about compensation at such a level of detail. In the past, the Turkish-Greek exchange, for example, was you couldn't pull that off today. I mean, it was just sort of said, go take a home that someone vacates, go to the other one. Boy, that wouldn't. Maybe you could set up a system, but a big investment.
You get that through war, people just fleeing for personal safety.
And we're still cleaning up the claims after war.
Yeah. Okay, the floor is open. Let me just pick out this gentleman in the first row, and then Steve, and then Jeremy have their hands up, and Ed Epstein, and we'll go on like that.
Yeah, just a general question. What are the elements of political pluralism that count, and how do we weigh them? I remember an article written by Bill Zartman in the 60s about the real threat to African cohesion of African countries because of the really terrifying amount of pluralism that existed, ethnic and religious divides and linguistic divides, and these were artificial nations, and how can we call them countries, and how can they function, and how can they become democracies? Impossible. And he identified one country that didn't have all of these elements and said this was the surest example of potential success. It didn't have any ethnic divisions, and it didn't have any linguistic divides, and it didn't have any religious differences, and there were cultural harmony in the country, and it was Somalia. So we could predict success for that country. What are the elements of pluralism that matter most, and are they all weighed the same in each country? I mean, when we have South Africa winning the World Cup in rugby, that was an example of all people coming together and eliminating all their divisions and celebrating a great victory. So too with the victory of Mandela in the elections.
David has suggested that we take several questions at once and then maybe pool them. I think that's a very good idea. So, Steve.
So, Jack, you said Steve, so both of us are going to quickly go. I thought it was very interesting. The panel was great, but we didn't talk about cultural or identity change at all. We talked about cultures as if they were fairly static. And it strikes me, Jason, to just pick on you, the cases you talk about are ones where, for example, in Switzerland, there really is a deep sense of being Swiss, which is remarkable. I mean, despite the various institutional dimensions that you describe. Indonesia, I think, is a case where, despite, again, a lot of diversity, there is a strong pride in being Indonesian. You can create identities that never would have occurred to anybody, and they can stick for a while. So my favorite example, I like to talk to my students about whether they could ever be persuaded they were a council person as their national identity. Students say, a council person as my national identity? I say, yeah, Sovietsky Человек. That's what Soviet person means in Russian. It's a council person. And it stuck, you know, for a whole generation of people who fought the Nazis. They were Soviet people. Took it very seriously. So since cultures are changing like that all the time, it strikes me that before we start worrying about, you know, population transfers, which have historically been incredibly bloody, and I agree, leaving long-term scars, civic identity can be quite capacious and can actually be the easier path, seems to me.
Thanks. I'd like to, Steve Fish, Political Science Department here. I want to pick up on something that Steve started talking about and address this question really to all of our panelists, but to push back a little bit against some of the things that Jason said, just to kind of be the devil's advocate here. You know, you started off by saying that you were skeptical that democracy was, you know, all that good at managing pluralism on the ground, meaning just, you know, ethnic diversity, socioeconomic, communal diversity, and so on. But, you know, if you look at the region that you know we study, if you look at Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, you know, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Estonia, these are vigorously multinational countries, multi-ethnic countries that have done very well in terms of democratization. Places, they're certainly more ethnically diverse than places like Belarus or Hungary, where now there's more backsliding going on from democracy right now, certainly in Belarus, obviously for a long time, Hungary even now, than is going on in Slovakia, Bulgaria, Estonia. And Belarus and Hungary, of course, are much more homogeneous in ethnic terms. You know, one of the things that comes out of the scholarly literature on the relationship between ethnicity and conflict, and ethnic diversity and conflict and ethnic diversity democracies, you can't find a correlation. Now, we don't have good data on ethnic diversity, to be sure, but we do have some data. And you cannot make that variable matter. It doesn't seem like countries that are ethnically diverse have any disadvantage when it comes to democracy. It doesn't seem like they have any disadvantage when it comes to violence. And so I'm wondering about the basis for your skepticism about the ability of democracy to handle conditions of communal or ethnic pluralism, when even in the region we study, it seems like a lot of the shining cases of success, both at controlling violence and at democracy, the success of democratization, have in fact been vigorously multi-ethnic countries, and some of the backsliders have been relatively ethnically homogeneous. And you mentioned you know, the dictatorial features that actually are what allow democracies to be governable, but you know, I mean, any plural in any polity, as I think Danielle and David have pointed out. Democracies as well as non-democracies, of course there are going to be some neutral, non-elected arbiters. You know, in any democracy, democracy is not just about whoever wins the elections being able to do absolutely anything they want to do. The protection for minority rights is very much part of any established democracy in the world, including the most majoritarian democracies, not the United States, which is not very majoritarian, of course, but the most majoritarian ones. And I wonder what you have in mind by dictatorial institutions. I mean, do you mean independent courts or an independent Federal Reserve? Agencies like that, which certainly are independent in some sense, but if they are appointed ultimately, or if their policies are ultimately affected by elected officials, certainly to call them dictatorial institutions, I think, is quite a stretch. I think that they are not directly affected, not directly governed by voters, but to call them dictatorial institutions strikes me as a bit of a misnomer, and I would just call them a part of any normal functioning modern democracy.
It is a great panel. Thank you very much. I have no question to ask you Danielle, because you said so much. I'm still absorbing it. But it was extremely useful. I even learned from you, Jack, in your offhand comments, profoundly. But I want to make a short comment, a short anecdote, and then ask a question to Jason, and then rephrase that question somewhat for David. And my anecdote is really to illustrate the to me, it's futile to try to ascribe somehow common features to all democracies. I remember a man I worked for, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. He used to meet François Mitterrand, and they would argue about one thing repeatedly, and that was about Trudeau's concept of Canadian democracy and rights, which are not vested in the federal structure. They're vested in the Charter of Rights. Trudeau believed deeply in the rights of minorities, that they had to be vested. Mitterrand found this to be absolutely objectionable to his concept of democracy, which relied on the French Revolution's basic precept, 60 million citizens, and that's all there is. And in France, of course, as you know, you cannot even collect statistics on minorities because it's against the law. But both of them were fervent Democrats. So I simply wanted to make that point, that there's no single definition of democracy, and we shouldn't sort of try and aim at it. Okay, Jason, I think I may have misunderstood you, but I want to get to the bottom of it, if I can. Sure, okay? I mean, as you know, we're really talking about the subject of pluralism because we're scared as hell about what's going to happen in Syria, because there is a pluralistic problem. It's got to be reconciled to democracy. That's the point. Now, you quoted something you read on the website of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. And as I remember it right, I didn't write it down, you said that they, speaking I think about the Egyptian agitation day before yesterday, they really deplored the violence in Egypt. They deplored it. And at the same time, they deplored the movie made in this state, actually, whose properties, you mentioned the word humiliation.
That's their words.
Their words, yeah. Yes, humiliation, and degraded people, and they deplored that too. Now, I'm a Democrat, and I deplore the hell out of it. So, this then led you to jump to questioning the competence of Morsi to be a president of a democratic Egypt. And I don't get the jump, okay? David, could you tell me something? You quoted in one of your slides were pretty good, by the way. Don't feel bad about your slides.
I feel terrible.
No. And they were very interesting. But you had one there.
Oh, it's still up.
You had one, and I wrote down the words that the purpose of law, okay, a purpose of law was to protect fundamental rights, including the security of persons. I agree. Do you not think that a movie of this kind actually jeopardized security of persons? And if so, what is the recourse legally against the perpetrators of something as grotesquely destructive as that? And I don't want to get into it, except that you know not only did they produce this grotesquely hurtful, destructive document, they then grotesquely misled people about who financed it in a further destructive little twist in this country. Now, I'm the biggest First Amendment guy in the world, but I simply do not see how people can plead First Amendment prerogatives to justify something as abhorrent as that. And most countries have hate laws which wouldn't permit it. So I ask you as the lawyer to say, what's wrong with that?
Okay, Ed Epstein has had his hand up. He's going to be the last questioner, and then we're going to turn it over to the panel. And if I may invoke economy of expression among all who continue to speak.
Okay, I'd like to raise 2 points. One is triggered by this gentleman's comments. A number of years ago, I taught at the University of Indonesia on the subject of business ethics. Now, don't laugh, because at that time, business ethics were very, very problematic in Indonesia. But I remember the issue of, once again, the individual in the community, free speech. And it was in the context of satanic verses. And the right of the individual as opposed to the mores or the expectations of the community. And I argued, if you will, the First Amendment type of position, and a gentleman wearing a cap got up, which indicated that he was religiously oriented. And he said, but the book destroyed or threatened the harmony of the community. He didn't mention Pancasila, but of course Pancasila, harmony of community, is very, very basic. So juxtaposing the right of the individual to express as opposed to the right of the community. So this is an anecdote, but I think goes to some of what's been said here. The question I really wanted to ask is that no one has mentioned geography at all as it relates to democracy. And there was a very interesting book review, I think it was in the Times last week, where he says, all you international relations scholars, geography is very, very important. And as was expressed to me in Russia, going back there, by a colleague, and it goes back to the days of the little father, the Tsar, it goes back to Soviet days, that Russians are much more concerned about security than about democracy. Internal and external security. Security in the sense that with all these different groups, with the vast geographical space that Russia has, that if there isn't a strong central power, that you had the potential for fission, that the whole thing would just disintegrate and fall apart. And then another aspect in terms of geography is that Russian borders, some of which are very vulnerable and exposed to potential, from the Russian point of view, foreign aggression. So here too, there is a great concern as to who are in its borders, what their power position is vis-a-vis Russia. And I'm just wondering if among the variables that we should be talking about, or at least considering, is this question of geography.
Thank you. These are all great comments and questions, and we'll take, give everybody some opportunity to respond. You want to start, Jason?
Okay, yeah, so if I miss something, my apologies. Come up to me after. I'm going to try to hit everything, at least briefly. So the first point is that the elements of pluralism are not necessarily ethnic. So I mention them because those tend to be the most deeply divisive, but they don't have to be. Homogeneous countries can also be deeply divided for all kinds of reasons. I don't know Somalia at all, but or what happened there, but they can be just as divisive as, even if they're less descriptive, they can be just as divisive. And so I only use those as a kind of an example. The question is really what you have in common, and this gets to Steve Hansen's point, about Swiss identity. I mean, that may be true, and it may be the reason why Switzerland didn't fall apart completely, and you have a cantonal system. The only point I was making is that, apparently, they resolved whatever conflicts they were having in what I would term an anti-majoritarian way, so that the French Swiss are not subject to the more numerically more numerous German Swiss, and they get to decide the things for themselves. Now, this moves into Steve's point about all, my whole point actually is that all democracies have dictatorial features, you know, admittedly might be a little overdrawn as a term, but they all have, in order to function, all modern democracies has to shield some aspects of policy making from the popular will. All modern democracies, economic policy, environmental policy, you know, central banks, courts, they're all shielded from direct democratic. Now, you know, the curious thing about modern democracy is we focus totally on the inputs on how leaders get elected, but we actually don't care that much about democratic outputs, which is what the you know, Soviet Union and other countries used to talk about how they have more democratic outputs than we do. Now, you know, my point is that you know, 5 years from now, you know, we may realize that there was greater pluralism in Egypt under Mubarak and in certain kinds of pluralism, and in Syria under Bashar al-Assad than there will be under who knows what's going to happen in Egypt. I mean, I'm not predicting the future, and whatever comes up in Syria. Right? And so in some sense, there's maybe a trade-off between the amount of democracy you have and the amount of pluralism you have. In fact, this is just empirically true. Sometimes there is a trade-off that you have to make. And each society has to decide, you know, what kind of trade-offs that they want to make. Now, it's not my place to impose on the Egyptians what kind of society they want. But I'm just saying that as a matter of values, I mean, these are not my ideas, by the way. I mean, Sam Huntington and a zillion other people have talked about this in the past, that you just have this trade-off. And I think it's important for us to recognize the necessity of having anti-democratic features in order to have modern democracy work at managing pluralism. And that once we admit that, then that sort of opens things up a little bit about the kind of democratic institutions in other countries. And I don't think we should be as embarrassed as some people are about saying, okay, you know, you may need to shield some of these you know, rights from the will of the majority, and you know, and be satisfied with that because that's the way it happens in other countries, as opposed to being embarrassed about it, as some people are. And then finally. By the way, I'm the devil's advocate, not you, just for purposes of... And then finally, on the last point, and very briefly, I actually wasn't questioning Morsi's competency, but you know, I think it is not deplorable what that, you know, we fought wars of religion here, and they lasted a long time in, you know, Western Europe, and, you know, our systems are the fruit of an outcome of the wars of religion in which we gained the right to tell religious people to F off or to, you know, to choose to be free from religion. And I think he has an absolutely an indelible right, whoever did this, to do whatever they want. And if some people are offended by it, that's too bad. We have ways of, you know, dealing with people that are offended. You know, you can take them to court, you can talk about defamation, you know, blah, 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 we can resolve the conflict, but, you know, I'm totally on the side, not that I would do something like that, but, you know, like Alan Dershowitz defending Nazis in Skokie, you know, I'm the first one that says, you know, you don't have a right to kill somebody because you're offended by something. You just don't. Not in our system. You just don't. And you know, and I don't like government, you know, imposing these kinds of restrictions on people, because I'm talking about the U.S. now. I'm not talking about what other countries decide. You know, that's not what this country is all about. And that's why we allow this guy to make films, and we allow other people to do pornography, and we allow other people to, you know, write books, and we defend their right to do it. I mean, I don't know whether you would say a First Amendment absolutist, whatever you want to call it, but I think for the future, it's not that he's not competent to be a democratic leader of Egypt, but I think this does not bode well for minority viewpoints. I mean, apparently the guy's a Copt. And this is what's most unfortunate about this film incident, is that the Copts in Egypt are going to pay for this if this turns out to be true in a big way. And innocent people are going to die, you know, because of it. But I don't think it bodes well for Egyptian pluralism at all that the Muslim Brotherhood, of whom Morsi is a member, and they're the ruling thing, you know, have this kind of attitude.
I'm going to just make a couple of very quick comments, even if the questions weren't directed at me. I want to quickly address the first question of sort of which aspects of political pluralism count and how do we weigh them, and with a very political sciencey answer, which is that There's no uniform answer to this, because what matters is which elements of pluralism become politically salient, which ones are caught up and can be mobilized to affect change. And I think that we often actually, as observers, pay way too much attention to things like ethnic identity that are not politically salient in many parts of the world, or religious identity for that matter, which is actually one of the reasons I wanted to talk a little bit about regional elements and how those identities can come up. And to Steve Hansen's point about identity change, I would add further to that to say, because all identity, again, I'm going to sound like a political theorist here, but because all identity is constructed, you can hold multiple identities at the same time. And this I saw extensively in both Russia and Indonesia. In Indonesia, Indonesians are very proud of their Indonesian civic identity, but they're also very happy to tell you what tribe they're from, and they hold an enormous amount of pride in that ethnic identity. And I found that to be true in Russia as well. I was doing a project that wasn't about identity at all, but the very last question of my survey, just to try to collect some demographics, was what nationality do you consider yourself to be? It does not necessarily have to be the nationality on your passport. And when I conducted these interviews in Krasnoyarsk, I collected a very large number of people who identified as Siberian. Okay, so that tells us something too about what identity means to them. As far as geography is concerned in its relationship to democracy, clearly the size of Russia, and there is no other Russia in the world. It borders 14 countries, has the largest land border. There's also, I mean, Indonesia is another interesting case. This is why I study them. You have these large, sprawling geographies. It's very difficult to broadcast power to the peripheries. However, most large countries in the world have succeeded with the exception of China and Russia, really, most other large countries have succeeded in marrying democracy to the securing of large borders by adopting federal systems, or systems where you can decentralize certain levels of local government. So it makes it possible for the federal government to focus exclusively on managing those borders. And that's something where, even though Russia is a federation by constitutional means, it's a very anemic federation, and there's very little power in the regions.
David.
So thank you. I'll be quick since we're off to dinner. I had really, I'll cut it to 3 comments. Well, one goes to Steve about identity change, and I would emphasize that, and I find that very helpful, because I think that's buried in what I was saying about rule of law allows a space for these cultures to have pluralism. It doesn't doesn't reinforce identity, but rather it allows them a space to change, to exist as they are and to change, which I think is hard for courts to do, I would say. The second is, if that's true and you need a legitimate mediator to somehow enforce, to try to create that condition, Syria is going to have a very hard time about that. And it's so complicated because, in terms of historically, we're ruled out of trusteeships or colonialism. I mean, the type of outsiders that could help somehow in a transition period man the courts, that's not going to happen. So I don't see what the solution is right there. I wanted to go to our devil's advocate, thank you, Jason, and to this question about Morsi that you asked very pointedly, because I heard a different cut from Morsi where he said it was contrary to international law, so my ears went up immediately on that. And I don't think freedom of speech is that clear internationally that it would be contrary to international law per se at this moment. But what I find difficult about Jason's position is an image of what is right within our community, regardless of its implications in other communities, is therefore right. We have a very strong view of free speech globally. So it's not the European system. The European system, no swastikas in Germany, no selling on the internet in France. I mean, you can agree, it's very hard to avoid the slippery slope. You can agree on very specific things. So if Egypt had the right international law, I don't think they can go after this guy. But if Egypt could say, Arab League, we agree that production, in a treaty, production of such a movie in our jurisdiction must be regarded as a crime, right? Probably is already, right? But then you ask others to join that. And I mean, that's entirely possible. If you really keep the category small, and obviously it's all about the subjectivity of the listener, which makes it the problem, but the sensitivity of the listener, but it would seem possible.
Well, first of all, let's give the panel a great round of applause.